Welcome to everyone joining us from across the UK and around the world. This is the second in the series of Future Fossil Spring Talks. The talk series is part of an engagement programme for Future Fossil, a new artwork from Something and Son, who are made up of artists Andy Merritt and Paul Smith. Future Fossil is commissioned by Milton Keynes Council for Oxley Park in Milton Keynes. The four talks explore the ideas and questions that Future Fossil raises, the artistic practice of Something and Son, and the role of public art at this time. My name's David Farrier. I'm Professor of Literature and the Environment at the University of Edinburgh and the author of a book called, coincidentally or not, Footprints in Search of Future Fossils. And it's my pleasure to host this evening's event. Which is called Artificial Traditions. And what we're going to explore is what happens when art is placed in the landscape. The talk is going to last around 1 hour, 15 minutes, and the last 20 minutes will be an opportunity for you, the audience, to ask questions of the speakers. So in order to do that, please use the Q&A function on Zoom to ask your questions. I think the Q&A function will be open from the start, so you can add questions at any point, but we will keep them until the end. And just so that you know, the chat function will be disabled, so please do only use the Q&A function. Great. So I'd like to welcome our guest speakers, and then we're going to hear from Andy Merritt of Something and Son, who will tell us about Future Fossil. Dorothea Von Hantelmann is Professor of Art and Society at Bard College, Berlin. Her books include How to Do Things with Art, The Meaning of Art's Performativity, and The Exhibition, Politics of a Ritual. Nick Axel is an editor for eFlux Architecture and head of the Architectural Design Department at Gerrit Rietveld Academy in Amsterdam. He's currently working on a new Holocaust memorial complex at Babin Yar in Kiev, Ukraine. And it's our great pleasure to have both Dorothea and Nick here to talk tonight and share their thoughts and understanding about artificial traditions and all that follows from it. But now I'd like to introduce Andy Merritt of Something and Son to tell us about Future Fossil, the artwork.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to do a little presentation, and which will go through the project and also touch on the subject matter of tonight's talk. Right, I'm going off two computers, so I'm hoping I line them up together. So Future Fossil depicts a house from Oxley Park that has been fossilised through the passage of time, being enveloped by rising water, encroaching deserts and man-made materials that nature has processed and reformed even. The house has slowly decayed from the inside out, leaving an imprint of the Anthropocene era. It is made from the materials of our time, concrete, but the latest neutral, carbon neutral type, unrecyclable plastics and metal. The sculpture is embedded into the landscape. This is a map showing the area of Oxley Park that the sculpture is located. And the house itself is kind of, there's a fragment of it that is still intact, and then the rest of the sculpture is kind of the footprint essentially of the sculpture. And it kind of sits within a valley that's a very small valley that has, it's part of the sort of man-made landscaping of Oxley Park. So Milton Keynes kind of epitomizes the Anthropocene in the sense that it's got people had the ability and the mindset that it's possible to build a whole town from scratch. But it's also in the midst of building, sorry, I'm just getting my notes wrong. And then this is Oxley Park itself, which is, followed the same footprint essentially of the grid, So it's the last of the grid of Milton Keynes. It's on the very outskirts of the town, stroke city, and it's the same. Yeah, the same thing happened essentially. It's originally it was fields, and then over time, over the last sort of 10 years, essentially, it's sort of turned into a fully formed village or section of the grid. Unlike the centre of Milton Keynes, the majority of Oxley Park's architecture represents a sort of hark back to traditional cottage type architecture, but in reality is a sort of mass-produced housing which is tweaked slightly from house to house. In Oxley Park, there is a tension of whether it is a village or a square that's part of the wider grid of the town. Future Fossil plays out this kind of tradition in both its form and function. The sculpture mimics ancient pagan gathering spaces, as seen on the left, which is Stonehenge. Buttercrosses, which are found in old villages and towns, which were sort of structures that were placed over the natural crossing points or paths that people were treading, and became meeting places and places to trade. And the more recent Victorian period bandstands, which means that the sculpture will essentially provide a sort of performance space. So it's trying to sort of tie the three together. So like on the subject of tonight's talk, traditions start as something new. All traditions begin artificial. It is time that makes them traditions. Future Fossil will speculate on the traditions that between now and in 10,000 years' time might manifest. What will the culture be when in the future they unearth the fossilized house? Essentially it will probably be very different to our culture, a world centered around wholly on human and its thinking and priorities. So will people in 10,000 years' time predominantly be obsessed with capital, consumption and progress, or will they have learnt from our mistakes? Right now, nature and so humanity is something to analyze, pin down, cage, watch, tame, plant and mass farm. But Future Fossil tries to tie nature and people together again. The rear of the sculpture will self-seed, it will have places for other species to live, while the front tries to tease out human nature, which is inherently social. The sculpture is literally an open house, a place for everyone and everything. And that is the end of my little presentation.
Fantastic, thank you, Andy. It's a fascinating project, and such a stimulating one. And the question, what will the world be like in 10,000 years' time, is one I think that just immediately stimulates your imagination and produces all kinds of rich lines of thinking and questioning. We're going to cover lots of different topics in the course of this conversation. A bit later on in the discussion, we'll be thinking about ritual. And so I'd like to begin by asking our speakers, which rituals have sustained you in the past year? In this difficult, challenging time, have there been rituals or traditions that have kept you going? And if you don't mind, Dorothea, I'll ask you if you wouldn't mind answering that first.
Nature, being in nature. I discovered it was only in the last year that I turned being in nature into a ritual. I really made sure to sort of leave the city and be in nature once a week. And I more and more realized that was really, I was looking forward to that Sunday walk, and I really felt like I needed that. And so to step, I mean, which is what rituals do. They give us an opportunity to step out of the everyday scenario and enter a different sphere where we connect something higher, which in that sense was for me the energies of nature. So maybe that's what I really discovered or really kind of cultivated throughout the last year.
Yeah, I think that's quite common, isn't it? And the question is, will these rituals carry on? Will they, as they have sustained us through this difficult time, will we then carry them on? Everyone hesitates to say when normal life resumes, but when perhaps the worst of the pandemic is behind us, when we are out in the world again. Nick, have there been rituals that have sustained you in any way?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a curious question because, I feel like over this past year, as a result of the pandemic, we've all been kind of overwhelmed, maybe not with ritual, but with repetition. And so, something that has been very meaningful to kind of create moments of punctuation in kind of the flattening of time almost. I mean, it's been kind of rather generic. I mean, I'm lucky enough to be able to live with my partner and to maintain the ritual of having dinner with each other every night. And then, occasionally on weekends, kind of expanding the dinner table, maybe even just to include one other person, but still kind of even treating food with a degree of I don't know, of preciousness based on the gathering. I think that's been really, really important for me over this past year.
Great. Yeah. So almost kind of realizing the ritual potential in everyday activity. Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you. Andy, have you got any thoughts about this? Are any rituals sustained you?
Yeah, I go to a cemetery every week. Because there's, like in London, the cemeteries are, some of the most wild places. And so it's part of one of the Magnificent Seven that were built in the early 19th century. So like 7 cemeteries that were built around London. And this one's like extremely wild now, and is looked after by a great organization. And they pocketed in the 80s, they buried a few of the, knocked down a few of the gravestones and created these clearings in it. And it's kind of like they're the perfect size for gathering spaces. So, like in December, we had our son's birthday in the cemetery because it was like a great place to meet.
Wow.
But yeah, it's been a really important place to go to, and it will be after all this as well.
Yeah, I'd like to throw a question out first of all to Dorothea in this respect, because you've written about situated artworks in the past, and I'm going to, if you forgive me, I'm going to quote you back to yourself. You've written that situated artworks are works that do not want to be autonomous, that are not exhibited in the sense of showcased objects, but enter into a connection with the place in which they are embedded. So I'd like to invite you, first of all, if you'd like to expand upon that idea of the artwork in connection with a place, embedded in it. What is that? What does that imply? But particularly, what do you see as the relationship between an artwork like Future Fossil and the environment in Milton Keynes where it will be placed?
Yes, thank you. I'm happy to do that. So maybe if you allow me, I'll take a little bit of a turn. So the reason why I came up with this idea of the situated artwork, or maybe to explain why I came up or why this became important to me. So first of all, we could say, of course, that, in the past decades, all major topics, themes that concern us have found their reflection in art, from globalization to post-colonialism to migration movements to feminism, then recently more, questions of structural racism and the ecological question, or the anthropocenic disposition, or however you want to call that. But I think that in comparison to all the other themes, this last question of the ecological crisis, if you like, does confront us with some fundamental tensions when we want to reflect that in art. And these tensions do not necessarily have anything to do with specific artworks or individual artists or their, you know, ecological goodwill. They reach deeper. They reach to the, they concern the specific way of being of the artwork in modernity. Or in philosophical terms, you could say they concern the ontology of the artwork, which, so in a nutshell, I think where I see the problem is that, you know, an ecological thinking is a thinking in connections. It concerns connections between living organisms and their environment. But the artwork in modernity is conceived as being autonomous, and autonomous means separated from connections. So, you know, the Madonna painting in the chapel had been separated from this ecology, this network, this context, if you like, to be integrated into the museum. So there's an act of separation that historically precedes the idea of the ex minus hibited, so taken out artwork. And then it encounters viewers that, you know, the name alone says it all, are reduced to their visual sense and bereft of their embodied connection to the world. And all this happens in a place that is the paradigmatically separated space, which is the white cube, you know, where climate is controlled, temperature is controlled, where all references to the organic are excluded, and so on. And all of this became so powerful in modernity because it corresponds to a modern mindset in which the idea of separation plays a pivotal role, you know, or even becomes the driving force of modernity. From the general ways, you know, modern societies are structured, separating state and church, to the division of labor, economy, production, to, you know, separating knowledge into different academic disciplines, healing into areas of specialization, and all of this has been like a very productive dynamic. For instance, you know, enabling us to separate nature, to think of nature as being something separated, something that presumably, you know, exists independently, which allows to see it as resource, which allows a mass of increase in productivity, affluence, and so on. And so I see the modern understanding of what art is deeply connected and deeply embedded into this whole sort of driving force of modernity, which is at its core, in its DNA, a movement of separating us from one another, nature from culture, and so on. So now we more and more come to understand the limitations of that attitude, and also understand the ecological, but also the economical, the social consequences, and try to bring things back together that have been separated over the past 200 years. And in that context, of course, a project like this one is deeply interesting because it really shows us that, you know, we shift from an, I mean, in art theoretical terms, you could say we shift from an aesthetics of the work, the artwork, as something enclosed, as something separated, as something finished, you know, to what something, yeah, I mean, in this previous text I wrote situated, but actually thinking about this evening, I was more thinking about the term of composition as one that I find really interesting in this. And it's actually, I'm taking my cues from Bruno Latour here, who says, you know, we shift from an age of critique to, or criticality, to one of care and one of composition. And composition means to bring things together and to shape the way they relate to one another. And this is what I find so fascinating about this project, that really can be understood as a composition of, you know, bringing human and non-human human actors together in different forms of agency, but also different temporalities. I mean, our human time, and then thinking a temporality that exceeds human time. So how to, and a composition that doesn't have an end, that is situated, embodied. I mean, I wish we were a bit more embodied here, but I mean, our conversation here is part of that composition. And Andy, as an author, is part of it, and he catalyzes, and he's the reason why we are here, but he's not in control of everything. so it introduces a whole different understanding of what art can be as a moment or in initiation, triggering a composition to emerge that then takes its life on its own. And I find that a very interesting and provoking and really substantial idea of how we can rethink what comes after art. I mean, in modernity, or what art in the 21st century could be, and in a certain way also should or has to become.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, it's striking, isn't it, that one of the consequences of kind of living in a late capitalist environment is that it's left us feeling so alienated from the world around us. Andy and Nick, it'd be good to hear your thoughts about this as well. In Future Fossil in particular, how do you feel that the work addresses this alienation? What can it do to remedy or counteract the separation that Dorothea is talking about? Is that even the right question? Should we be thinking about it as a kind of antidote to separation?
Well, I mean, in my opinion, it's a question of how that antidote is actually administered, right? It's not necessarily that like there is a problem and then the solution is kind of the opposite to that problem, right? Because I mean, as you mentioned, David, I mean, I agree. I do think modernity has progressively alienated us from our environment, from our bodies, from our minds, etc. And so, you know, the way that I kind of see the question of emplacement of an art object here. I mean, I really appreciate what Dorothea is saying. I approach it maybe from a more almost phenomenological way, where you know, I think one of the functions of an artwork here might be to alienate others. And so, you know, I'm almost imagining, and this is something that I think this Future Fossil work does in a really kind of interesting way, not in an aggressive way, but you know, I'm almost imagining, you know, a resident from Oxley Park kind of walking down the street, you know, one day and just like turning and seeing this thing there, and then this thing that's in the landscape turns to the person, and they're both like staring at each other and being like, what are you doing here? Right. And so I think that, you know, I almost would, I think that in that kind of maybe mutual recognition of like, where does all of this come from? That actually there can be a certain degree of affinity and affection between these two things. Right. So that you know, I think that, you know, one of the things that this installation is doing very well is that it's employing almost like the uncanny, right? Where something is very familiar, but at the same time, it's very foreign. Right. So I think that offers a lot of potential for appropriation, right? And for a very kind of intimate relationship between the bodies that inhabit this space and the artifacts that shape it.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I love that idea of the artwork as a kind of arrivant that just appears, and it's almost like interpolating people into a whole different time scale, a whole different order of time. Anyone who comes across it, and there is, of course, something very uncanny about that. Andy, was the uncanny something that you had in mind, or is that perhaps an unexpected outcome of this?
No, yeah, what it is supposed to be. It's kind of, I guess, like one of the images that I saw at the start when we were designing it or trying to design it, was an image of a boulder in Saudi Arabia, where it's you know, like it's essentially a boulder within the desert, and then a building had been carved into that boulder, and it's got that kind of familiar but not familiar as well at the same time. And it was about trying to bring those two together. So it's kind of, there's an invitation to come in with the sculpture. There's an invitation to come in, through the everyday form of the house, but then there's also the weird element to it as well, which kind of means new things can happen here. And it's trying to sort of fit the two together, essentially.
Definitely. And I love the ordinariness of it, and the way it reveals the kind of the extraordinary potential within the everyday, and the way that deep time is an intimate part of the everyday life, the present of the everyday lives that we live. That our time is marbled, it's woven through with deep time scales as well. Nick, that nonetheless is quite a difficult thing to grasp. I think we often struggle to imagine the deep future. What for you is it that makes that difficult? What's the nub of that challenge of imagining the deep future?
I mean, I think it's a really good but really difficult question. I want to say entropy, right? I mean that time kind of erases itself in a certain way, and matter changes forms, and within the forms of material that we see in the environment, it's very, it appears to us as such, right? As a thing, right? A piece of wood appears to us as a piece of wood. A piece of meat in a supermarket appears to us as a piece of meat in a supermarket. We don't necessarily have the faculties to look beyond what is immediately presented to us and to think about maybe where something comes from. Part of this or maybe, this tendency is kind of emphasized by a degree of precarity that is experienced by people, not just in Milton Keynes, but also like well beyond, right? Where there's an increasingly there's almost a shortening of our perception of time, right? Where, especially actually the pandemic really did this for me, where it became increasingly difficult to see, more than a couple days in advance.
Yeah.
And so, I think that we need these tools, these devices that can help us learn to look at things in a different way. And maybe the way that that Andy is using materials in this way, this composite plastic agglomerate, is actually one of those ways, right? Because when you're looking from afar, it will have a certain appearance, but then as you get closer, and so maybe from afar it'll just look like a rock, but as you get closer, you might start to recognize like a toy that you used to play with as a child, right? Or you might recognize, a bottle cap, or something that clues you in to be like, wait, what actually is this, right? So I think that I think we have it's difficult to comprehend deep time because we so often are not kept in a state of wonder at just like the fact of the world, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Dorothy, I wonder if you would like to come in here. You were talking earlier about literature and composition, and how do we compose in these in this context?
I wanted to add something because I do not really have a problem with alienation, and I would agree to what Nick said. I think the fact, so when I speak about sort of connectivities or embeddedness, I think is the term that Andy used in his introduction. I mean that more on a structural level, like how the artwork is conceived, how it functions, how it's laid out, how it includes all these kind of human, non-human, its embeddedness in different temporalities, but as an experience. I don't mean it in the sense that, it's catering to you, or it's kind of, connecting us all, or make us feel sort of comfortable in being connected or something. More to the opposite. I feel like these alienating aspects are deeply important to make us understand because these are the moments where it sort of goes beyond the anthropocentric also, it's not catered to me. It's not the artwork that, functions as a magnet and wants your attention or my attention. And sort of, it's really sort of touching on different levels of time, of perception, of cognition, and I find this very important. About the deep time, yeah, to be honest, I'm not really an expert in that, but it made me think of, or maybe I can contribute something by relating to this to an idea of art, because in a way, you know, what art in modernity through museums, etc., has always been an intergenerational dialogue. You know, that's what museums stage, and that's also what makes it interesting, because, you know, and it's about representing, but also promoting and advancing long-term change of values, which is significant and also politically significant in a society where everything is short-term. Because the market, I mean, the temporality of the market is the short term. The legislation period of politicians is short term. So this is more about administration of values. But the museum is interesting because it thinks differently. It thinks of, and I always when I talk about this to my students, I always say, like, museums functions in the future perfect. You know, they think of, they for instance acquire artworks for their collections because they have in their mind, like, this will have been the present, like in the future this is an important artwork because in 30 years people might think of this as being representative for our time. So I see more, instead of sort of speculating what will be in 10,000 years, the question that concerns me more is, like, how do we envision the present from the future perspective?
Yeah.
What's the set of values that is inscribed in such a project, as opposed to, you know, a public sculpture of the 19th century, you know, which is like the emperor of the empire in bronze or something, you know. That's what we always do in art, and that's also what makes it interesting to experiment with new forms, with new structures of thinking that promote ideas or propose something of how to develop further, and to carry that beyond the human time span of thinking in decades is interesting, and also, of course, what makes it relevant in an anthropogenic dimension.
Absolutely. And so it's absolutely right that we're faced with a kind of a challenge to our empathetic and ethical imaginations, aren't we? And I wonder if you know what Nick was saying earlier about wonder. Maybe wonder is the vehicle, or maybe the fuel that allows us to make that leap, to stretch our imaginations far enough, our empathy far enough to think about generations that have yet to be born. Can I just remind everyone who's attending, you can add questions in the Q&A if you'd like to put any questions to anyone or everyone on the panel about anything that's been raised, or perhaps thoughts that you've had about Future Fossil. Nick, you've been involved in the design of a new Holocaust memorial at Babin Yar in Kiev. I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about that, because it's a fascinating project.
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to. It's a complicated project, so I'm not sure how good of a job I'll be able to kind of summarize things. But basically, we are confronted with a history that has not been recognized. There was arguably the start of the Holocaust took place in Kiev in September of 1941. On 3 days when around 34,000 Jewish residents of Kiev were brought out to a ravine and killed. Over the next few years of the occupation of Kiev, the site became a deep space of tragedy. Over the years afterwards, after the war, the Soviet Union effectively refused to acknowledge the genocidal aspects of this event. This act of erasure of history was intensified by a series of landscape actions that were taken both intentionally and unintentionally. The space was dramatically terraformed, and actually a lot of the evidence was kind of disappeared, be it by intentional flooding with mud or an unintentional mudslide. And so, we are positioned here today in 2021, asking what it means to think about these events in the past. We are asking, how does one commemorate and recognize an event that happened almost 80 years ago, which is, there are very few survivors still left. So what does it mean to communicate and to transmit a knowledge to generations who only progressively feel more and more disconnected from this? And so, we're taking kind of a step away from let's say a tradition of commemoration, particularly with regards to the Holocaust that developed over the 1990s and 2000s, which was to create like a museum that presented a narrative. What we are doing is we are approaching the landscape as kind of the most precious artifact for exhibition itself, but at the same time, it's an active public park. And yeah, we are, we're working to establish almost a field of memory that allows visitors, either when they're using the park or if they go there explicitly for this, to discover their own narrative and their own relation to this history and to this place. And of course, we're using many different tools such as architecture, landscape, sculpture, art, etc.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And because it's a fascinating question that you raise about connecting us with a time that is not our own, memorializing, and the difficulty in doing that. And the idea of creating a field of memory resonates, of course, a great deal with Future Fossil, although it's a memory for the future, and that's a very difficult thing, I think, to get our heads around in the way that Dorothea was drawing attention to the complex tenses that this kind of thought work can involve us in. To remember the future it requires a great deal of agility. I wonder if you've got any thoughts about how do we memorialize events that have yet to happen?
Was that a question to me?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Perhaps one of the best ways of doing that is to just mark the present, to create a reference point, right, where a measurement can be taken, right, where thinking that 2001, 9/11 was almost 20 years ago, that just the fact that we can begin to measure, not just measure, but that we can feel time, that we can feel the duration of time passing. I think that's an incredibly significant thing. So, in this, let's say the inauguration, or let's say the arrival, right, of kind of this new feature, this new element, this new character in the built environment, I think can allow people to really kind of grow up around it. And to create these durational relations, right, that may, just they might happen, maybe only 60 years from now. Who knows?
Yeah. I'd like to throw that out to Dorothea and Andy as well. You talked about the ability of placed artworks to help us to feel time. And is that more in the materials? Andy, you've put a lot of thought into the materiality of Future Fossil, or is it more in terms of how that place is practiced, how it's engaged with? Is it how we move through the space, or is it it's kind of tactile, its textures?
Andy, you want to go first? Or should I?
You're muted.
I think that's
You go. Sorry.
Well, while you were talking, I was thinking, it reminded me of like a year ago or so. I went to France, and I went into a Gothic cathedral, like actually a huge Gothic cathedral in the city center, and it really struck me as an experience. I mean, I must say, like my academic work is on museums, and what really drives me is the question of sort of why have museums lost their kind of authority, which I feel they do. When I go to an art museum today, I feel like, oh, this is so 20th century, and what does that mean? And then what could be 21st century, and what are these temples of modernity, and why did they become so popular and so important and so widespread on a global scale by now, and what could come next? So I'm interested in these rituals, if you like, and with that in mind, I went to a cathedral, and I was so struck how it, like, instantly, like the moment and I'm not a very religious person, like the moment you're in there, it deports you into a different relation to time, and you hear the outside traffic, so you have still a connection to the everyday, and yet it really transcends that. And even though that was built hundreds of years ago, it still has this incredible power, like instantly. There wasn't even a ceremony going on. And I found that extremely interesting and so rich. Like, how poor is a museum compared to that, as an experience? And so for me, it really motivated to me to kind of do research on places. And to answer your question, I think it's not something alone. It's really that as a composition. It's the architecture, but it's also certain practices. It's the materiality, but in that sense, it's also the smell and the sound and the sense of light that comes through these windows. And it's a craft. I mean, it's a craft to design such a space, and to that is so powerful over the centuries. And I think we can only, because we're in this huge transition where I feel like we don't know yet. It's search movements for new kinds of gathering places or rituals, if you like. And as we are involved in these search movements, it's interesting to research these kinds of places that exist, in various cultures, and might be much richer in many ways than what modernity came up with. Even though that I'm not saying like we want to kind of go back to cathedrals. I'm aware that this is not an option, but still it's quite interesting and powerful places to look at.
Yeah. Well, if you mentioned Latour, if he's right, then we've never been modern. So
yeah.
What hell? Andy, would you like to say a little bit about how Future Fossil was designed with community participation in mind? I mean, that seems to be a very important part of the project.
I mean, I guess it's kind of similar to the cathedral in the sense that it's kind of it's because that's essentially kind of your senses were. It picked on your senses, and I think that's something that we've lost, isn't it? It's kind of like that's where the museum kind of falls foul. Everything's objectified. You just look at it, study it, but you don't sense it. And I think that's kind of like a core part of what's kind of missing in humanity right now. And that's what we kind of want to do with the sculpture. On multiple levels, and that's kind of like including it being used rather than looked at, just looked at. Like the look, like the because it must have been amazing. Like that cathedral must have been amazing when you believed in the religion that it was built for as well. It would have taken you onto another plane. It would have been the biggest structure you'd ever seen. It would have, like the way it plays with light and stuff like that. It's amazing, and they just they nailed that propaganda, and that's kind of what we're doing, but on a local level. And I think local's important right now because there's not much of it. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, a phrase that's been running around my head all through our conversation and in the lead up to this, thinking about future fossil, is a quote from the geographer David Matlis, where he says that landscape is a verb, not a noun. You know, that we practice these places, and that's what realizes them. That's what concretizes them, I guess. Which, you know, leads very nicely on, I think, to that idea of ritual and what kind of, you know, what might be practiced, what kind of new traditions we might look to create in a site like Future Fossil. The title of this talk is Artificial Traditions. So I'd like, first of all, what do we all have the same, a common understanding of ritual? The ritual's been mentioned various times as in terms of repetition, in terms of an action that takes us out of ordinary time. Are there other resonances or forms of ritual we need to keep in mind here?
I think important is the embodied character of ritual. Rituals most often, more often than not, operate through the body and the senses, and often on a nonverbal level.
Mm,
And why is that so? Because, you know, values and need to be embodied in order to become effective. Like, why do we kneel down in a church? Because it's not enough to sort of say I'm modest. Like, you have to prove it, and you have to do it, and then even if you don't believe in this kind of humbleness, the idea is that doing it nevertheless over the course of decades, you somehow, it soaks into your kind of individual and collective consciousness. So it also puts, you know, the individual mind in perspective, because the meaning also functions through the body and the senses. In general, I would say it always has something to do with symbolic practices, with practices that mean something. In doing them, you produce some kind of meaning. So I mean, in a way, what Andy said at the beginning, that which is also what I would have said, that of course every tradition is artificial. It's constructed and composed. And also we could say that everything is a composition, but using these terms shift the focus to the question, not is it composed or not, but how is it composed? And maybe the how is it composed of the Catholic ritual is not because it's overwhelming and yeah, driven by an ideology, an idea of the individual that we would in the 21st century not want to adhere to, but the question of, okay, how do we want to compose something, with what kind of which parts of our bodies or minds or senses do we want to become part of a composition today? How rigid do we want to? I mean, the church is quite rigid, you know, the one that speaks to the many. The museum, as the kind of modern ritual, is much more individualized and flexibilized, but maybe too individualized and too flexibilized. Like, you come and go, and the average time people spend in front of artworks is, according to statistics, like 1.67, not quite unsatisfying for an artist who invested a lot of time into an artwork. So how rigid, how flexible, how individualized do we want these compositions to function? And also in that sense, I think Andy's project is super interesting, because it's not proposing a fixed form. You know, I see it more as part of these search movements on the way to, okay, we have churches, that's kind of pre-modern, or theaters, if you like, also kind of as a gathering format, kind of pre-modern. So that's the collective, the one that speaks to the many, which is also, you know, the format of educational systems, or the courtroom. It has something to do with authority, with like a fixed frame of beginning and ending, and you better stay and shut up and listen. And then we have these kind of individualized gatherings. People come and go as they like, which is much more modern. But then what could be a new form that is neither the one nor the other? And can we try things out that way? And I think, yeah, that's where we are. And these terms like, you know, ritual or composition, they are not they don't define a form. They just more sort of shift our awareness to the processes of composing or embodying or creating something.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just speaking to everyone who's participating, please do add your own thoughts about ritual in particular to the question. I would love to hear your thoughts about what rituals might help connect us to deep time, what ritual means to you. Any thoughts you might have on the possibilities of future fossil as a kind of a place of ritual activity, whatever that might mean. Nick, we've heard about various different kinds of ritual spaces and practices therein, places of worship, museums. Are there other places or kinds of ritual that come to your mind that we might want to bear in mind and that might be useful in connecting us with future generations?
Yeah, so I mean, I think ritual, it is something that can be very, and it can be very formalized. But I think it always precedes that formalization, right? So I actually wanted to go back, and I'll circle back to something that Dorothea was saying about the intergenerational nature of museums. And I think, it's, while they are intergenerational institutions, the temporality of an artwork might be that it is exhibited for 3 months and that's it. It never gets shown again. And this is very different for a public artwork, of course, right? I mean, like Future Fossil, right? Which will probably be passed by people from Oxley Park every single day of their life, right? Or for years and years and years. And so, it's almost yeah. I mean, at least that's the. I mean, Andy, we're holding you to this 10,000 year thing. That's a lot of but no, I think what happens when you do that, right? Like, what happens when you see things over and over and over again, right? I mean, Walter Benjamin spoke about, or he said that architecture is best enjoyed in a state of distraction, and that we almost need that distraction because there's no other way we notice it, because we're so used to it. And so, public art, in this sense, it almost kind of needs to be designed for the subconscious. And in that sense, I think that there's, when something just like really becomes a part of a domestic environment, I don't think we can necessarily say what it will be, what sorts of rituals will arise. But at least ethically, I think that we should appreciate whatever does. And I really mean whatever. Right? This may be used as a place where, kids from down the road like practice dancing. Or it's where, teenagers go and smoke pot to get out of the house and not do it in front of their parents, right? And, through these like very kind of quotidian acts, or maybe, it's just like where you meet and hang out with your friends after getting home from school, right? I think that new meaning gets created, and so I see rituals as something that's kind of emergent. But at the same time, I think that, there are ways that, that this can be maybe like engendered or stimulated or something. And, so of course, this is a bandstand, or it's a stage, right? So it can, of course, be programmed. And I think, Andy, there are plans for this to be programmed. But what if we didn't think about program as this thing where, like, we invite a band and they play and everybody gathers? The form of the form of the installation itself, I think, is very significant here, right? It's a house, right? And so I would really hope that, maybe people go and use this space to do things that they would normally do in a house, right? Maybe like to have dinner, right? Or, maybe it will be like a big picnic spot because it's kind of in between. I really see this as kind of an in-between between public and private, because it's not really just like a platform. It's not entirely public space. And yet it has a very kind of strong imprint, literally, of the domestic, right? And so
Yeah.
I would, yeah, I mean, I would really hope that, you know, we can look at kind of the ways that rituals are currently present within this site, within the area, and that this can be a space to elevate those and to strengthen them and to reinforce them.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you, Andy. Would you add anything to that idea about what kinds of rituals you'd like to see practiced in Future Fossil?
Yeah, I guess at multiple levels, it's kind of the everyday is important, and the most important. I just I'm just kind of interested about how it might manifest over time. It's kind of the looseness there, you know, like it's got no door on it. You can't you can't control what goes in and out of it. So I haven't, but I just feel like it's a kind of space that will hopefully encourage people to use it in a different way to how they might use other spaces, just because it's just because it doesn't look particularly normal. And but at the same time, you know, like Nick was saying, it's kind of I also want barbecues to happen there and whatever. Just, you know, but yeah, I mean, I'm also, whilst we've been talking, I've been imagining what would happen, how would it have been if we had done this project 400 years ago, like how it would have been used then. You know, it probably got burnt down or something. I mean, it would have either gone, you know, either it would have been revered or it would have been, you know, the devil. But yeah, I'm just interested about at the core of it, like all our work is really just sort of everyday use. That's at the core of it, and like the everyday ritual, like that, you know, the rituals that we look back and revere now, hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, were just everyday events. They weren't anything massively spectacular. And that's what this will be as well.
I love the idea of Future Fossil as a venue for a children's birthday party. I'm feeling slightly regretful that my children are a bit too old for that now, but it just sounds amazing.
Yes.
I've got one last question for, sorry, Andy.
Well, just that, like Ursi and Moriam are kind of who are working on the community involvement with it. And there's plans to have farmers market there and
brilliant,
things like that. And I just love that kind of juxtaposition between the two. Will be great.
Definitely. I've got one last question for everyone. This, if anyone else who's watching would like to post a question, please do get typing. So this is a question to all three of you, and it's I'm asking you to sort of imagine yourselves on a committee who has been charged with designing a Future Generations Day, an annual day to remember future generations. And it will be staged at the site of Future Fossil. I'd like you just to suggest one idea of an activity, a practice, or whatever it might be that could contribute to Future Generations Day that would help us connect with generations yet to be born.
I would. It's more. Initial idea was just that, you know, future generations will want to eat, and it's trying to think, well, what do they need to eat in the future, and to try and sort of celebrate those things that will allow that to happen. Whatever
feasting.
That is. Sorry.
Feasting.
Yeah. But feast, maybe just sort of understanding how you're feasting, you know, like where that food is coming from.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you. So yeah, a kind of storied meal.
Yeah.
But can I just add that, I mean, I don't have an immediate answer, but I'll think of something, David. But I just wanted to add that I mean, as much as I like the kind of fantasizing about what's going to happen there, I do think the sort of equality of this project is also its sculptural it works also as a sculpture. I mean, the part of imagining what could happen there is also something, you know. It doesn't need to be activated in order to produce something, because it has these really interesting sculptural qualities, you know, the domestic, the here and now, the shell that looks like other houses, that is so relatable for people, because it really mirrors their environment, and yet the outside, which points to something that goes so far beyond. So I do think these sculptural qualities are also really important, and also speak for themselves when nothing else happens. So I think it's the mix of both somehow.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Nick, what would you offer to the committee on Future Generations Day?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one of the best ways to guarantee a future is to recognize that one has a past. And so, you know, it's very banal, and it could very easily be co-opted by some not so nice political forces, but maybe it's just a day of remembrance, right? A day of kind of recognition of like where we all come from. Right, almost like tracing, you know, like almost. I work with this artist, Jana van Heeswijk, and she does this workshop exercise called Timelines of Belonging, right? So it's like narrating kind of how we came to the space where we are, and so yeah, maybe something like that.
Yeah, kind of, you know, expanding our sense of our own timeliness. I think, yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, everyone. It's time to move over to the Q&A section. So please do continue to add questions, comments, anything you'd like to offer really into the Q&A box. The first one is from Christine. She says, 10,000 years, why choose this future time in particular? I'm interested in the notion of deep time and how that is communicated to an audience. So maybe, Andy, you could take that for us to start with. Why did you pick 10,000 years as opposed to any other?
You could answer that one as well, couldn't you? Because you said 10,000 years, and just coincidentally, you said 10,000 years as well. So, I mean, I can't quite remember why we chose it, but there's the I mean, it's more than 10,000 years ago, but it's near. The agricultural revolution happened that long ago.
Yeah.
And, you know, I feel like we're in the midst of the next one. Well, we have to be, or else we're all gone. So it's kind of around that, really. It's kind of like, I think within 10,000 years, we'll be in a very different place. But it will put it, but like we are now, we're still tied to that agricultural revolution. They will be tied to the way we're living in some way. I don't know how, but obviously, yeah. So that's why.
Yeah, I mean, I just echo that. It's the symmetry of it. It's, you know, thinking about, you know, what you know, rounding off slightly, but you know, the you know, thinking about the entire duration of human civilization as we know it, and then thinking, you know, what can we cast that far forward in the future? Because that's really what's at stake here. I mean, there are, you know, lives are very literally at stake in the ecological crisis, the climate crisis, but human life as a, you know, as a thing is not so much as a certain way of life that, you know, that we have become used to. Will that be sustainable? Will our culture persist, or how radically will it have to change? So it's that time frame, I think, opens up a space for many of those kinds of questions. Nick and Dorothea, would you have anything to contribute to that question of what, you know, why 10,000 years is a useful time frame to think about?
It's tempting. It's tempting now to be distracted reading all these questions, these really interesting comments and questions. I must say, I don't have developed skills yet to switch between the one and the other.
Well, we can move on. I think Nikki's question about what kinds of rituals we envisage
Well, hold on.
Future Fossil have been answered. Oh, sorry, Nick, did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, just
Okay.
about this kind of question of 10,000 years, because there's another question about this from Poppy, right? And so, I mean, I just, the way that I want to think about 10,000 years right now is, you know, how we position ourselves in relationship to that, right? I think this, this artwork, this piece of public art is in a way saying that like we like that this should be remembered in 10,000 years. Right? There's the question from Poppy is like, you know, should we use more ecological or sustainable practices in art today, like less synthetic materials, less waste, and so I'm kind of like relating to that question as well, because I think that it's quite it ties in quite nicely. I think it's really a question of like how we see the role of art. Like, is it, you know, I think what one could argue that, you know, as Dorothea was saying, that the role of art is to be remembered, right? That it is an intergenerational project. But I think you can equally take a position that actually art, you know, is meant to transform lives and be forgotten, right? And to disappear, right? So I don't know. But I think, you know, there, and I guess it's also a bit unfair to say that, you know, like Andy is saying like, this needs to be remembered in 10,000 years, because it's also just a reflection on like what would be left in 10,000 years.
Yeah.
But still, like, this thing is legitimately designed to survive an apocalypse. So, so, you know, it's, I don't know, but I think it's a very interesting question of positioning and longevity and yeah.
Yeah, thinking about the, you know, the question of remembering or forgetting is set me in mind of another project or another question that takes 10,000 years as its time frame, and that is the, you know, the safe storage of nuclear waste. And there have been, you know, since the 1980s, various different strategies proposed to, you know, to make sure that this material remains safe within the, you know, across that time span. The semiotician Thomas Seabook, I'm sure you'll be familiar with this, proposed the creation of an atomic priesthood that would transmit knowledge about you know, through a specially designed ritual and a kind of mythology, knowledge about the danger of this material on a kind of 3-generational relay. In a way, in a sense, trying to kind of keep pace with linguistic change so that the message would always remain legible, understandable, current. In New Mexico and Carlsbad, the United States are building a kind of mythic landscape of markers to show the location of where they're storing their nuclear waste. And in fact, one of the emblems that they've chosen, again, because language isn't, you know, no language we speak now can you know, compares with the language spoken 10,000 years ago. So to kind of beat that problem, they're going to, you know, cover these landmarks with these monoliths with human faces modeled on Edvard Munch's The Scream as a kind of transgenerational symbol of disgust and existential dread. But in Finland, they've taken completely the opposite approach. They're building a deep earth repository that when it's full, they plan to just bury and leave to be forgotten. And it's an interesting question. Do we trust in the future enough to kind of sustain the messages, sustain the myths or the rituals, whatever form we give it? Or is it better to trust in amnesia? More questions, I think. So Karen says, I feel ritual gives the masses a timetable and expectation of what's to come, made by those in control. That's why public art is so important. It allows the masses to see things in a completely different way, to question everything. And I think that is related to Fanny's comment that I'm thinking about the word freedom. The rules of formal rituals limits our behaviors, but at the same time allow us, as Dorothea says, to really dive in and feel. In a way, it simplifies our way in. On the one hand, if we have complete freedom to move around, it is up to us and our responsibility to how to relate to that certain place. I guess I'm just questioning spontaneity in rituals. What do you guys think? How do we negotiate between, you know, the formalized and the spontaneous, or the free or the idiosyncratic? in ritual?
I think a lot of it has to do with quite boring and banal things like, you know, like what's the police presence in this neighborhood, right? Or what are the sorts of like regulations that will determine access to this? And also, you know, what sorts, similarly, like what are the sorts of policies that are in place to almost guarantee a longevity of this?
Mm, mm, yeah.
Well, I mean, there are so many questions, and I see one of a former student of mine, which I would like to, but it's so complicated. I really don't have enough time, Mila. I'm sorry. But I also wanted to say, you know, I mean, the reason why we feel like often rituals have something repetitive and dogmatic, and is also because they are quite, I mean, like church rituals are go far back in time. You know, they also come from a time. This is one aspect. So if we rethink the idea of ritual in a kind of modern, more individualized, flexibilized sense, it could also allow more spontaneity. But then, of course, if you read Durkheim, who wrote a lot of stuff about rituals, he would also claim that people acting together produces something, energy, if you like. So the power of people acting in some, you know, if it's a protest march or a pop concert, like the collective evanescence, this energy that is created by people acting together in some kind of coordinated way is also quite powerful. And then, of course, the question is how this is used or misused or controlled or not controlled or whatever. But as a there is a certain power to that is also interesting, like the energy of pop concerts, for instance. There are so many others. I also wanted to say something that to Poppy's question about the materials, because I just throw this in. I think that's super important, because art in so many ways is a culture of saying things, you know, of representation. It's a culture of like critiquing what, you know, on saying and so on. But our present problems, ecological ones, are not solved by saying things. They imply actions, obviously. So of course, the question of which materials we use, or I was involved in an exhibition over the summer where we didn't allow, you know, climate control and air conditioning, and had no electric light. So as soon as it turned dark, the exhibition was in the dark. It was super interesting, actually. But so really little things, banal things, but they changed the entire idea of the exhibition, basically. So I think there's a lot to explore when you relate art more to the field of an aesthetics of acting.
Yeah.
But there are so many
absolutely
others.
Keep going.
Well, with apologies to everyone who's put a question in that we haven't had time to get to, maybe just ask one final quick one to the panel. Aldo has suggested that the new town idea, like Milton Keynes, is quite utopian, but the future fossil seems rather dystopian. And I wanted, do you agree? Do you feel that future fossil is dystopian, or would you want to describe it otherwise?
Me.
Andy?
I would describe it otherwise. I would describe it as more like realist.
Realist. Okay. Andy, how do you think of future fossil? Dystopian, realist, or other, ultimately?
Yeah, realist, yeah. It's using the materials of our time. It's casting a house that is of our time. The nature that will grow on it is of our time, because it's decided to grow on it. Yeah, realist. I'll go with realist.
With realist. Dorothea, what would you say?
I can understand that, but what I like about it is more the speculative aspect, I think. So it's a third space, perhaps.
A third.
Neither the realist nor the dystopian.
Absolutely. I'm going to invoke chair's privilege and just suggest another way of looking at it as well. I think there is something rather hopeful about it, if only because it, you know, it poses that question, which, you know, I think many people have said is the most important one of our time. How do we become better ancestors? That seems to me the first thing that future fossil speaks, certainly to me. And there is no more hopeful question, of course, to put to ourselves, because we all want to be better ancestors. We all want to hand on a world to our descendants that is as good a place to live and flourish as the one we have known, if not better. So I appreciate Aldo's suggestion that there can be a dystopian edge to this, but I think it asks many other kinds of questions. But isn't that part of the richness of it? I think that is time. So can I just say thank you to a few people. Thank you to the audience for your questions and your participation, and to each of the contributors for their fantastic contributions and insights. Thank you to Milton Keynes Council and the project team for organising the talk and all the work behind the scenes. I invite everyone who's attended to follow Future Fossil on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook. It is readily searchable and very much worth doing, just to see there's so much going on beyond the sculpture that you'll want to find out about in terms of resources, talks and more. There are in fact other talks available in the series. All will be available on YouTube. So do check out the Future Fossil website for information about this and the next talk, which I hope you'll join us for, which will focus on collaboration and the art of working across different disciplines. Otherwise, thank you everyone for attending and contributing, and have a very nice evening. Goodbye.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, dude.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.